Yes, class, welcome back. It's Mr. Cablan here, and I'm here to now do the second lesson for chapter 6, which deals with equation of a line in the form of ax plus by plus c is equal to 0. Now, this is a relatively new topic here, so what I want to do is, again, quickly revisit what we've covered so far and how it relates to today's lesson. So if you take a look at the screen here, again, here's our magical whiteboard here with all the formulas from the last chapter as well as the last lesson. What we're going to see for today is that we're going to learn a brand new form of an equation called standard form. And basically how it relates to this is the fact that we're going to start off with something that looks like this. Ax, okay, plus by plus c is equal to 0. And again, we're going to go through the details behind what all of that is. And basically what we're going to do here is we're going to do some algebra that we've been doing this whole time here. And what we want to do here is to change this equation in standard form and make it look like this during a series of several algebraic movements or operations. So that's the key thing that we're going to do in today's lesson. So based on that, let's get this started here. And like I said, what we want to do here is just to go through the sequence of steps and see how we can change one form of the equation to the other. So this is just another way to write down linear equations. It's just another form that I'm introducing you to. So what exactly are we going to be doing to go from standard form to y equals mx plus b? Well, as I said before, when we're looking at equations of lines here, they do come from different forms. And the form that we're going to look at today and learn is what's called standard form, as I mentioned earlier. And as you can see, with standard form, you have the x term, the y term, and c on the same side there. And what we want to do there is to take that equation, rearrange it, and put it in the form of y equals mx plus b. And remember that m represents the slope and b represents the y-intercept. So you're going to be hearing that all over this chapter here. So as I said before, ultimately what we want to do is to isolate y, which is just a fancy way of saying we're going to leave the term with the y alone until we absolutely have to deal with it. And when we're looking at these questions, like I said, what we want, our ultimate goal in each case here is to take a look at an equation and leave the y alone. Now, what's important when you're rearranging an equation from standard form into y equals mx plus b is actually the order that you perform the algebraic techniques here. So if you take a look at a question A over here, what we want to do here, and I'm just going to put a blue box around it, is to leave the term with the y alone. So if you take a look at what I have here, I'm just going to put a blue box around the y, okay, just to show you that that's going to be the term we're going to leave exactly where it is. Now, what we want to do for this question here is we want to remove everything else that's around it, so it's in the form of y equals mx plus b. Now, since we want the equation to be in the form of y equals mx plus b, the very first term that we have to move here has to be the x term. So notice what I've done here. I've now put a red dot box just to show you that we're going to take this x over here, move it to the other side, and then make it negative. So that's our very first movement there, all right? Now, after you move the term with the x, the next thing you need to do here is to take the number, including the sign in front of it. And in this case here, what we have here is this -3 over here. And we're going to put it the other side, and then that now becomes +3. And then and don't forget that when you move this number to the other side and after you change the sign, just write it in front of the -x that's already there. All right. Now, the next thing we want to do here is just to identify the m and the b. And don't forget one little thing that we should fill in just in case you forgot is that when you have a negative and a variable, there's an invisible one located right in front of it like that. Now, when you're identifying the m and the b, a good way to do it is actually to write down y equals mx plus b either above or below that equation there. And just for space, I'm going to write it below. So for example, if you want to figure out what the m is, you just line up the m with the number that's right associated with it. So that's going to be our m, and our b here is going to be +3. And that's pretty much it. All right, so now that you've seen one example here, let's now take a look at part B over here. Now for part B, notice that the term with the y has something that's attached to it, specifically a -2. So I'm going to put a blue box here around the -2 just to show you that we're going to leave that alone until we actually have to deal with it in the final step here. Now, just like the previous question, what we want to do here is take the x term first and move it to the other side and then change it to the opposite sign, which in this case here is negative. All right. So as you can see, the first step is exactly the same. Okay. Same thing with the next step. In the next step here, we're going to take this positive 8, move to the other side, and then make that negative. All right. Now, this is where this step or this question is different from the first one that we just did. Okay, remember in chapter 4 when we're solving equations, what you have to do in order to isolate the variable is to divide both sides by the coefficient. This one is no different. The only difference with this one here is that we need to divide each term by the coefficient or the number that's attached to the y. So what we're going to do here is we're going to divide each term here by -2. And remember, the reason for that is to cancel out the 2 -2's on the left side and then simplify everything else. Now, before we actually solve for this here, just remember that anytime you have 2 negatives, make sure you change that to a positive. Now be careful with this next step here, because remember we want to leave all our slopes, if they are fractions, to leave them as a fraction in lowest terms. So when I take this this x over here, which has a divisible 1, and I divide it by 2, I'm just going to leave it as 1/2. However, this 8 over here, when we divide it by 2, we wind up getting 4. So the equation of this particular equation is in the form of y equals mx plus b will be y equals 1/2x plus 4. All right. Again, the reason why again it's 1/2 is because the x here, remember, had that invisible 1, and we're dividing by 2. But again, to keep your slope as a fraction, lowest terms. Whereas this one over here, when you divide the 8 by the 2, you get a whole number. Okay, so that's the reason why that's a whole number. All right, and then as you can see, we're going to line up the m's and the b's, and that will be your m and your b. All right, so now you've seen 2 examples in terms of how to change an equation from the standard form and into y equals mx plus b here. So let's take a look at another example. And just like the previous example, you're going to see that for this one, we're going to do the exact same thing. Okay, always make sure that you identify the term that you're going to leave alone. And I'm just going to draw a blue box around it just to show us and remind us that we are not to deal with that until we absolutely have to. All right, so just like the previous question, and you notice I've kept the instructions there exactly the way it is, just in case you forget. So in this case over here, you're going to take the term here with a 6x, move to the other side, and that becomes -6x. Okay, now you can take the -15, move to the other side, and that becomes +15. All right. Now in this last step, again, what you want to do here is to isolate the y. So you just need to divide every single term here by the coefficient, which in this case here is 3. Now, the good thing about this one here is that when you divide all these two numbers, the -6x/3 and the 15/3, it does give us whole numbers. So the final answer for this will be y equals -2x plus 5. And again, -6x divided by 3 will give you the -2x, and the 15 divided by 3 will give me the 5. All right, so to line up the m's and the b's, our m here, or slope, is -2, and our y-intercept here is 5. All right. So those are the basics when it comes to rearranging an equation in the form of ax plus by plus c equals 0 into the form of y equals mx plus b. So just to show you how the two are exactly the same thing, just in different forms. All right, so let's take a look at a word problem here. And as you can see, we have entrepreneur and rapper Jay-Z up on the top right-hand corner there. Okay, just as a sample of this particular example. So it says the equation 750 plus 25h minus c is equal to 0 is used to calculate the total cost a musician has to pay a music producer for the use of a recording studio. Okay, and it tells you here the letter H represents the number of hours used, and C represents the total cost. Now it says here, rearrange the equation into slope y-intercept form, and you notice that instead of y equals mx plus b, it's just rewritten using different letters, and what you have here is C is equal to mh plus b. Now, when in doubt here, if you're not too sure which one's the y and the x, okay, if you put in y equals mx plus b underneath it, and you line up the letters, you'll see exactly which letters represent which letters in the form of y equals mx plus b. All right, let's do this, and what I'm going to do here, I'm actually going to do this 2 ways, and the reason why I'm going to present this 2 ways, because there's actually 2 ways you can do this, and I'm going to tell you right now, you choose the one that you prefer in terms of what you need to do. And I'm going to explain why you can do it 2 ways for this particular question. All right. So the first method, we're going to stick to basics right now. We're going to do it exactly the same way that we've been doing it. So starting off with the equation. Now it says here, since we want the C on its own over here, okay, we're just going to remind ourselves we're going to leave the C alone until we have to deal with it. Now be careful with this one. You notice that there's a negative in front of this C. So believe it or not, this negative that's attached to C is still part of that. So not only are we leaving the C alone, but we're leaving the negative that's also attached to it until we have to deal with it, okay? Now, if you take a look at the form that we want, the first term we need to move, okay, is a term with the H. So what we have to do for this one, if you look at the 750 and the 25H, okay, we have to move the 25H first because that's what goes in the first spot. So when it goes to the other side, then it becomes negative 25H. All right, so that's step number one. All right, and step number two here, we're going to take the 750, okay, and it goes to the other side and becomes negative 750. All right, now in this next step here, remember we had a negative and a C here. So remember there's an invisible one that's hiding in front of this C. So to change this equation to make this negative C into a positive C, we're just going to divide each term here by -1. And all that does basically to the other terms is to change the signs here. So the two negatives here become a positive in both cases. So the equation that we have here as a final answer will be C is equal to 25H plus 750. All right. Now, I mentioned several times in class that math is the only language that I know of that where you can read from left to right and right to left. So you notice in this question here, okay, the equation is C is equal to 25H plus 750. So the next method I'm going to show to you, okay, is going to give us the same answer. However, it's going to look slightly different. Now, um, if I after this example, if you don't understand it, that's fine. You know, stick to the basics. However, when you see a question like this, and you notice for method number two, the in brackets, okay, it says make C positive. Now, what you have to do here is just think about what you can do to C or where it can move to make it positive. All right, and believe it or not, and I'll give you a clue. Compared to the other question that other example we just did, this one only requires one step. All right. So if you take a look at the left side there, the 750, 25H, and the negative C. Okay, what one move or one mathematical algebraic technique can we do to make the C positive? Well, I'll tell you. Okay, if you take a look at this negative C, remember when you're moving numbers or letters around, anytime that it goes to the other side of the equal sign, it just changes to the opposite sign. So you're going to see in this one, when this negative C goes to the other side, okay, it automatically becomes a positive. So what do we get here? The final answer that we're looking for. The only difference in this case over here, the C is on the right side and the 750 and the 25H are on the left, but they are exactly the same thing. Okay, now question is, how do we know that we can do it in that one step versus the other step, which took 2 or 3 different steps? A little bit of hint here. If you have a letter by itself and it's negative and it's asking you to isolate that or leave it alone, okay, that's probably the only time that you should do this. Okay, otherwise stick to keeping the letter exactly where it is and then move everything else. All right, so that's why when it comes to math, again, just think it through. Like I said, if this is something that you're having a hard time grasping, that's okay. Okay, just do it the other way and stick to what you're strong with there. All right. Okay, so in the next example, we're just gonna notice I've written down both forms here just to show you that they're exactly the same. And what we want to do here, just take a look at the equation to see which one here is the fixed cost and which one is the variable cost. Now, remember back in the previous chapter when we were looking at an example that was very, very similar to this, okay, I mentioned that fixed cost is the cost that does not change or the number that doesn't change in any way. Okay, and a good way to look at that is to look for the number that does not have a letter that is attached to it. So in this case over here, in both cases, you notice the 750 is by itself. So the fixed cost for this is going to be the $750. All right, so that will not change whatsoever. What does change, however, is this $25, okay, because what's changing the $25 is how many hours the studio was used here. All right, so when you're looking at the variable cost, okay, another way you look at it is that remember the variable is the quantity that changes, but we also now know that the variable is also another word that we use for the letter that helps us change a certain value here. Okay, and basically what's going to happen here, the 25, if you look at the 25, that's the number that's glued to the variable or the letter. So that there will be the variable cost because the 25 change will change depending on the number of hours used for the studio there. All right, so the again, that's why I put down there for the variable cost. The hourly rate is $25 or $25 per hour. Okay, so that's just making sense of what the equation is really trying to tell us. All right, last but not least over here. Okay, let's now just use a formula here to solve this problem here. So again, we're going to use the first one because it's the first one that I see. So all I'm going to do for this one is it tells us here, determine the total cost if a singer uses the studio for 8 hours. So all we know here is the 8 is the number of hours. And it tells us here in the question that H represents the number of hours. So all I'm going to do here is put in the 8 and replace it in for the H. Now again, using a scientific calculator, you could actually get this next answer in one shot here. So last but not least, when I put that in my calculator, you should get a final answer there of $950. So if the studio is being used for 8 hours, okay, the singer would have to pay a total of $950. All right, so that wraps up today's lesson here. And I just want to quickly just go over the board from the beginning over here. So this is where we left off. So basically, again, just to talk about the two forms that we have here, what we had to do in each case here was to leave the term with a y by itself. So just to use some basic colors over here, okay? Remember that any term with a y, I always left alone, okay? And I put a blue box around it, okay? And the reason for that is because that never moved. So step number one, you always had to move the term with the x first because the x here, okay, was the first term on the right side. So what you had to do for this one, put this in red, okay, you would have to take the ax term or the x term here, where the a is just the number attached to it, and that would have to go first there. So that's the first move that you would have to do here. All right, so take that, okay, and the next thing you would have to do after you do that, okay, then you would take the C term, okay, which was the number on its own, okay, and then you would write it after the AX term is on the other side there. So that would be step number 2, okay. So you can see here again, these are just the order of things that you would have to move the terms around. And then if there's a number in front of the y, okay, don't forget that you have to divide each term by that number to have the y on its own. All right, so that wraps up 6.2, the second lesson for chapter 6, and I'll see you at the next one.